Here is something that most people never hear, but that anthropologists have known for decades. Your brain is smaller than the brain of your ancestors, not by a little, by roughly 10%. The average modern human brain measures somewhere between 1,300 and 1,350 cubic centimeters. The average brain of a Homo sapiens living 30,000 years ago measured approximately 1,500 cubic centimeters. That is a difference of about 150 cubic centimeters, roughly the volume of a tennis ball, that has disappeared from the human skull since the peak of the Ice Age. And before you dismiss that as a trivial rounding error, consider this. A 1,988 study, published in the journal Human Biology, analyzed more than 12,000 Homo sapiens skulls from Europe and North Africa, and found that cranial capacity decreased over the past 10,000 years by about 10% in males and 17% in females. 17%. That is not a rounding error. That is a measurable, repeated, documented trend found in skull collections from Europe, Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Australia. And nobody, even now, can fully agree on why it happened. Before we get into the explanations, we need to spend a moment on the full arc of the story, because the shrinkage is only half of it. The other half is the expansion that came before. 6 million years ago, our last common ancestor with chimpanzees had a brain roughly the size of a modern chimp, around 350 to 400 cubic centimeters. For millions of years after that, the expansion was slow. Then, roughly 2 million years ago, something changed. A 2021 study, published in Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution, led by paleoanthropologist Jeremy De Silva of Dartmouth College, used change point analysis to map the precise moments when brain growth accelerated. The first major acceleration happened approximately 2.1 million years ago, coinciding with the earliest members of the genus Homo and the first evidence of stone tool use. The second happened approximately 1.5 million years ago, coinciding with a new wave of technological innovation in the archaeological record. From that point forward, across hundreds of thousands of years, the brain kept growing. By the time anatomically modern Homo sapiens were living in the caves and grasslands of the late Pleistocene, 30,000 years ago, the human brain had nearly quadrupled in size from that original chimp-sized starting point. It was the largest, most energetically expensive, most metabolically demanding brain any creature had ever produced. And then it started shrinking. The first thing most people say when they hear this is, wait, does that mean we are getting dumber? It is a reasonable question, and the answer from researchers is, almost certainly not, but the reasons why are more interesting than a simple reassurance. Brain size and intelligence, it turns out, have a deeply complicated relationship. Consider the blue whale. Its brain weighs approximately 9 kilograms, roughly 6 times the mass of a human brain. Nobody argues that blue whales are 6 times more intelligent than humans. Consider Einstein. When his brain was examined after his death, it was found to be slightly smaller than average, not larger. What distinguished his brain was not its volume, but its organization, the density and pattern of connections between neurons, particularly in regions associated with mathematical reasoning. The neuroscientific consensus today is that intelligence correlates not with raw brain volume, but with neural efficiency, the speed and precision of connections between specialized regions, and the particular architecture of the prefrontal cortex and its links to the rest of the brain. A larger brain is not automatically a smarter brain, but a larger brain from the same species as a smaller one still raises a question that demands an answer. Something caused the expansion. Something caused the contraction. And the answers to both questions reveal something extraordinary about the nature of human intelligence. Let us start with the expansion, because it sets up everything that follows. For millions of years, brain growth in hominins was driven by survival pressure in its most direct form. Every individual brain had to solve every individual problem. Where is the food? Where is the water? What is that sound in the grass? How do I make a tool sharp enough to process this carcass before a predator arrives? The environment was unforgiving, unpredictable, and could not be outsourced. Robin Dunbar of Oxford University proposed what became known as the social brain hypothesis, arguing that the most demanding cognitive challenge in primate life was not environmental navigation, but social management, tracking relationships, alliances, betrayals, obligations, and intentions across a group of dozens of individuals simultaneously. Every person in a band of 30 hunter-gatherers had to maintain a running mental model of every other person's behavior, reputation, and likely future actions. That is an enormous computational load. And Dunbar found a striking correlation. Across primate species, the size of the neocortex, the most recently evolved outer layer of the brain, scales almost perfectly with the typical social group size of that species. Larger social groups require larger brains to manage them. By this logic, the human brain grew as our social groups grew, and our social groups grew as our cognitive capacity allowed us to maintain more complex webs of relationship and alliance. Each individual brain was, in effect, a complete, self-contained cognitive unit, responsible for solving its own survival problems and navigating its own social world. That combination of pressures, environmental, social, and technological, drove the expansion of the human brain across 2 million years. And then, somewhere around 3,000 years ago, according to De Silva's analysis, the trend reversed, at a rate 50 times faster than the previous expansion. 50 times faster. That is the number in De Silva's 2021 paper that stops researchers in their tracks. The expansion took 2 million years. The reversal happened in the last 3,000. In evolutionary terms, that is not a gradual drift. That is a signal. Something changed 3,000 years ago, and it changed fast enough to show up in skull measurements across multiple populations on multiple continents. What was happening 3,000 years ago? Writing had been invented for roughly 2,000 years already. The first cities had been standing for roughly 3,000 years. Legal codes, taxation, organized religion, armies, schools, specialized labor. Human civilization, in its recognizable form, was hitting its stride. And De Silva's hypothesis, developed alongside Boston University behavioral ecologist James Traniello, is that this is not a coincidence. Their argument draws on an unexpected source: ants. Specifically, the study of how ant brain size changes across different species depending on how complex their social organization is. The researchers found a striking pattern in ant societies. Solitary ant species have relatively large brains for their body size. Highly social ant species, ones with large colonies, elaborate division of labor, and collective decision-making, tend to have smaller individual brains. Not because they are less intelligent as colonies, because the colony itself is doing cognitive work that the individual no longer needs to do alone. In a leafcutter ant colony, no single ant understands the entire fungus farming operation, but the colony operates it flawlessly because the intelligence is distributed, each individual contributing a specialized piece to a system whose full complexity exists only at the group level. De Silva and Traniello proposed that something analogous happened in human societies 3,000 years ago. As cities grew, as writing emerged, as laws were codified and specialists proliferated, the individual human brain no longer needed to carry the full cognitive load of survival by itself. A farmer 3,000 years ago in Mesopotamia did not need to know how to make a bronze weapon, navigate by stars, read seasonal animal behavior, craft a hunting bow, interpret medicinal plants, or settle tribal disputes. They needed to know how to farm. Other people, in the same city, in specialized roles, carried the rest. The cognitive load was distributed, and as the load on each individual brain decreased, the selection pressure maintaining maximum individual brain size relaxed. The brains got smaller, not dumber, more specialized, more efficient, plugged into a collective system that was, at the level of the city or civilization, far more cognitively powerful than any individual brain could ever be. This hypothesis is elegant. It is also contested, and the debate around it reveals just how genuinely complicated this question is. Researchers Brian Vilmore and Mark Grabowski of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, published a reanalysis of De Silva's dataset in 2022 that challenged the 3,000-year conclusion directly. Their argument: the dataset was too sparse in the critical period to support the claim. De Silva's analysis of nearly 1,000 skulls spanning almost 10 million years of hominin evolution included only 23 crania from the era most central to the shrinkage hypothesis, and more than half of all the skulls in the dataset came from the last 100 years of a 9.8 million year span. If you weight the sample that heavily toward the modern end, they argued, the analysis cannot reliably detect when the decline actually began. De Silva's team responded, defended their methodology, and the debate continues. What almost everyone agrees on is that the shrinkage itself, across the whole Holocene period, is real. The argument is about when, how fast, and why. And the why has multiple candidates, none of them conclusively settled. The simplest explanation is the one researchers call the allometric argument. Big bodies need big brains because more brain tissue is required simply to manage a larger body's motor functions, sensory processing, and coordination. When the Holocene began about 11,600 years ago, and temperatures warmed dramatically after the last ice age, human bodies started shrinking. Cold climates favor larger bodies, under what biologists call Bergmann's rule, a principle that larger body mass generates and retains heat more efficiently in colder environments. As the climate warmed, the evolutionary pressure favoring large bodies relaxed. Bodies got smaller. Brains, which scale with body size to some degree, got smaller alongside them. This explanation is not wrong exactly, but researchers have found that the brain size reduction is larger than body size reduction alone can account for. Something else was also at play. A second hypothesis argues that agriculture itself did the damage. Early farmers ate worse than hunter-gatherers. This sounds counterintuitive, but the archaeological record makes it uncomfortably clear. Hunter-gatherer skeletons from the late Pleistocene show excellent bone density, few signs of nutritional deficiency, and relatively large body size. Early agricultural skeletons, by contrast, show the effects of diets dominated by a small number of calorie-dense but nutritionally limited grain crops. Shorter stature, vitamin deficiencies, higher rates of infection. The brain is the most metabolically expensive organ in the body. It is also the last thing a developing body sacrifices when nutrition is inadequate. But it is not entirely immune. Chronic nutritional stress during childhood development can affect brain volume. And the transition to agriculture, which happened between about 10,000 and 5,000 years ago across different parts of the world, subjected generation after generation of children to exactly that kind of stress. This hypothesis has support. It also has problems. If agricultural nutrition was the driver, the timing should track the spread of farming. Farming spread to different regions at very different times. The brain shrinkage should show up at different times in different populations. Some of the data suggests it does, but the data is inconsistent enough that researchers cannot declare the case closed. A third hypothesis is perhaps the most philosophically interesting, and it involves a concept called self-domestication. Brian Hare of Duke University has spent years developing and testing the argument that modern Homo sapiens domesticated themselves, not deliberately, but through the same social pressures that domesticate other animals. In animal domestication, the most aggressive, reactive, and dominant individuals are selectively removed from the breeding population, either deliberately by human breeders or, in the case of self-domestication, by the social group itself. The result, consistently observed across domesticated species, is a syndrome of physical changes that appear together. Reduced skull size, shorter faces, smaller teeth, more juvenile facial features, reduced stress hormone responses, increased social tolerance. Hare argues that the same process happened in our lineage. As Homo sapiens formed larger social groups, and as those groups systematically punished or excluded individuals who were too aggressive, too dominant, or too socially disruptive, the genes associated with reactive aggression were slowly reduced in frequency in the human population. And the physical correlates of those genes, including skull size, came down with them. This hypothesis makes a striking prediction. Modern humans should look like a domesticated version of our Pleistocene ancestors. When researchers compare the skulls of Pleistocene Homo sapiens with modern skulls, they find exactly that. Smaller faces, reduced brow ridges, more gracile, lightly built skulls, the same features you see when you compare a wolf with a domestic dog. Hare's self-domestication hypothesis does not claim we became less intelligent. It claims we became more cooperative, more socially tolerant, more capable of functioning in the large groups that make complex civilization possible. And the smaller brain may be a byproduct of that shift, not a loss of raw cognitive power, but a reorganization of what the brain is for. None of these hypotheses is mutually exclusive. The climate warmed. Bodies shrank. Brains followed, partly. Agriculture degraded nutrition. Brain development was affected in some populations during some periods. Self-domestication selected against reactive aggression. Skull architecture changed as a byproduct. Collective intelligence through writing, cities, and specialization reduced the cognitive load on each individual brain and relaxed the selection pressure for maximum individual brain size. All of these things happened. All of them happened in roughly the same stretch of time. The honest answer, given the current state of the evidence, is that human brain shrinkage almost certainly had multiple causes operating simultaneously, and researchers are still arguing about the relative weight of each. But here is what the evidence does allow us to say with reasonable confidence. The human brain reached its maximum size during the late Pleistocene, roughly 30,000 to 40,000 years ago. The creatures carrying those large brains lived in small bands, navigated complex social hierarchies without writing or law, solved every survival problem individually, and carried the full weight of their own existence in the 150 extra cubic centimeters they had that you do not. They did not have libraries, they did not have legal codes or monetary systems or agricultural techniques passed down in written form. Every skill they needed to survive had to exist inside their own heads. The world they navigated was not simpler than ours. It was harder, more dangerous, more physically demanding, and more cognitively unforgiving in the most immediate ways. They were not smarter than you, but they were carrying more individually than any single modern human has to carry. And somewhere in the transition from that world to this one, something shifted. The cognitive load moved outward, into books, into institutions, into legal systems, into the stored knowledge of civilization. The individual brain got smaller, the collective brain got larger. Whether that trade was worth it is a question the evidence cannot answer. But it was not an accident. It was what we became. If that idea makes you look at the world around you differently, like every library and every law and every specialist you have never had to become is actually a piece of your own brain distributed into the environment around you, then that is exactly the kind of thinking this channel is built for. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, subscribe, and turn on notifications.